Okay, well, good morning and welcome to everybody that's joined us to this next event in our programme of events for leaders of professional services firms. This morning we have the topic that everyone is talking about and therefore I think of real relevance to us all. But I'll allow our speakers to introduce themselves and tell us why ESG and leading change in the professional services sector is so exciting and important to us all. We're lucky to be joined this morning by three exceptional speakers. We have Matthew White, BDO's Senior Partner and Co-Chair of BDO UK's ESG Board. Matt will introduce ESG, talk through BDO's approach and why doing the right thing is important. Next, we have James Fulford, Director from consultancy firm Eunomia Research and Consultancy. James will just talk through an introduction to some of the frameworks and mandatory reporting and have a look at some of the future direction of travel from government. And finally, to round up, Michelle Carroll, partner of BDO and also member of our ESG board, will talk through some of the ideology behind ESG and why that's important for your organisation. Just prior to starting out on this session, we did do a brief survey, so thank you for everyone who contributed to that. And just a couple of facts from that to mull over as we go through the session. All respondents to the survey responded that they either have an ESG strategy in place or it's being considered, so big positive there. We had a more mixed picture on linking ESG objectives to the business strategy, with 42% saying that was being considered and 28% said yes. Currently, only 28% of respondents have accountability for the business's ESG strategy and fulfillment assigned to a specific individual or team, whilst the majority of respondents are already publicly reporting on ESG, as many of us are already at 86%. So we are all at the stage of learning and evolving what we're doing on this, and we hope this community can be a positive forum for debate and any questions that you have. We will leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session. If you want to raise a question, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat function next to it, so not to be confused with that, but please do post questions as we go. We do have a few that have come through already, and we'll be diving into that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt for the first session. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So just from my point of view, I do feel a bit of a fraud being on this panel. I'm definitely not an expert in ESG. We as a firm do treat ESG as a real priority within the firm, and obviously as a senior partner, that rests on my shoulders from a governance perspective, and therefore hence my involvement. But I will go through a degree of, I guess, the journey that I've been on from that perspective. I'd also say that actually it is still work in progress in terms of from a firm's point of view. So we don't have all the answers, and similar to some of the respondents to the survey, we have started and we're on that journey now, but there's still a huge amount still to go. So my own personal journey, I guess, started most probably from more of a business interest perspective, if I am honest. So I joined a group called Chapter Zero, which looked very much at the climate aspect from a firm's point of view. And again, being really honest, I saw it as a great opportunity to network and therefore potentially gain additional business. And so I went in with one focus, but certainly after a few meetings, it became very clear to me that actually it is the impact of my firm, our firm, BDO, that I needed to concentrate on. We focus very much on the climate side of things at Chapter Zero, and I got a real understanding. And one of the key turning points for me was effectively seeing a film called Our Planet, Our Business. And that was a real eye-opener, as it said to me exactly what we were impacting in terms as a firm onto the environment and the ecosystem. In terms of, I guess, where I went from there is we started to have some higher level discussions. And it started to creep onto the board agenda. And again, what Chapter 0 tries to do is to force thinking in terms of climate onto that agenda for the C-suite. And as part of the process that we went through, we presented to our two, I guess, governance bodies, the leadership team, which is our executive, and our partnership council, which is our governance body with oversight responsibility. And in advance of having the presentations and pushing this onto the agenda, I did send every single member of the board the link to the film, Our Planet, Our Business. And for me, that really set up that discussion in terms of what was needed. In terms of, I guess, where we got to, one of the easiest things is to focus on just the E, just on the climate side, and hence we had a lot of discussion about actually how do we make sure the S and the G get similar airtime. We're a bunch of accountants, and therefore measuring things like on the environmental side is a lot easier than maybe measuring some of the governance aspects and some of the social aspects. And therefore, we really wanted to make sure that from a firm's perspective, we were paying sufficient attention to all aspects of ESG, not just the climate side. So following discussions, we did form a formal board, the ESG executive, which Michelle is a member of, and she will, I guess, talk a bit more about the external side of things, whereas my focus is very much internal in terms of the impact of BDO. And again, I sit on the Global Sustainability Steering Committee for BDO International, because actually as international businesses, it's the international footprint that I'm more concerned about, as well as just the UK one. In terms of the executive ourselves, we deliberately wanted to go cross-stream to make sure that we picked up everybody's different thinking in terms of how we go to market externally, but also influencing the internal streams, but also cross teams. So we do have non-partners on the executive, and actually having that diversity of thought has been really beneficial to us in terms of triggering different discussions and bringing through different ideas. We were very keen to have individuals who are passionate about all aspects of ES&G. However, we have to have that commercial background to understand that we are a business, and therefore, we've got to focus on a balance between the ES&G and also commercial return. And that, again, provides a degree of tension when you're relaying certain aspects to the business. As part of what we're doing, certainly from an early day, and our executive is very much an advisory body to both Partnership Council and our leadership team, was to make sure that we don't overpromise. And we've seen a lot in the press recently in terms of potential greenwashing, and therefore we are really, really sensitive to that, and therefore want to be measured. Next slide, please, Mel. So really where we got to in terms of why is it important to us, it very much focused on our core purpose. Our core purpose is helping you succeed, and that's deliberately vague in terms of the you. So the you could mean our clients, it could mean our people, our partners, but we took this literally in terms of you being the planet. And therefore, what can we do from a societal point of view to help society and the planet succeed? So we built this very much into our strategic framework. We're very, very keen to make sure that everything we look at has an ESG lens on it. It won't necessarily drive the decision making, but as long as we're focusing through that lens, we can actually see what is the decision point we're making. And for example, some of those aspects will be down to business travel, which is the biggest carbon aspect from a professional services firm, certainly ours anyway. Our people, we were really, really looking at actually who are the stakeholders when we look at ESG. And without a doubt, one of the primary stakeholders is our people. They demand that we are looking at ESG. They are probably the most vocal. We have Yama Group internally, and again, our people have set up There Is No Planet B, which again looks at the ESG type environment, but comments are made on there, and it has one of the biggest followings in terms of Yama. So again, our people are demanding that, so we could not have a choice of saying actually it's not a priority from a firm's point of view. From a societal point of view, again, we are very focused on making sure we can do what's best to help society succeed. And again, trying to pull all those aspects back, we're in a very privileged position from a firm's point of view. And actually, how can we influence and how can we get the best out of it? Just touching on a couple of others, regulatory, we're in a heavily regulated industry, as many of us are in professional services. Our regulator is absolutely focused on this as well. We do not really have an option in terms of not focusing on it. But again, as a stakeholder, we need to make sure that we're addressing their needs. The commercial one I have put in there because, again, for us, as I said, we are a commercial business. We need to make those balances, and therefore we need to make some difficult choices at that point in time. And therefore, having that commercial dynamic is really important. So when we set up our ESG executive, having that balance in terms of any of discussions and pulling things back from being too much of an eco warrior and saying actually what's the commercial impact of that is absolutely critical. And again, looking at business travel, we absolutely understand that we're not going to say we're banning travel. We know that face-to-face meetings are absolutely essential. However, having had the last 18 months on Teams or Zoom, actually gives us a real opportunity to build back differently. In terms of the human aspect, again, Andrew said, you know, why would we do this from a firm's point of view and doing the right thing? It is as simple as that. ESG is about doing the right thing. I think any responsible business needs to absolutely focus on this and make sure that we're doing it from the right basis. Next slide, please, Mel. So we did, when we sat down, tried to work out, this is a very busy slide, so apologies, you might not be able to read it, but it's there actually just to most probably illustrate and scare you in terms of what we started to look at, and depending on where you are on your journey, you may have come across this already. So this is effectively an ESG landscape. We sat down as an executive to try and pull out what were the key aspects that we wanted to focus on. And we soon found out that actually there's so many sub aspects to each of those pillars. So you've got the E and the S and the G across the top. And then it drops down into sort of things like climate change, where you look at carbon emissions. You can go from the social side into human capital, and you can look at your diversity and inclusion and well-being. And you can go from governance, so you can look at your corporate governance or corporate behaviour. So for professional services, again, that may involve something like taking on clients, so the client take on panel type stuff. So for us, we wanted to make sure we understood the landscape, but also understand that we cannot boil the ocean. So we have to be quite specific in terms of what it is we're looking to address and be really focused on those aspects. Otherwise, you just get paralysis because you just think, how can I address all these various aspects? Next slide, please, Mel. We didn't start with a blank canvas. One of the reasons we wanted the ESG executive to come into force is that we were doing a load of brilliant stuff across the firm. However, it wasn't really coordinated, and we weren't getting the biggest bang for effort. And therefore, actually, how do we pull this all together to try and create something that is sustainable in terms of the longer term delivery of these ideas, but also in terms of the impact overall. And that's the responsibility of the ESG executive, is to try and harness all this power. And again, things that we're already doing, 5+5 citizen strategy. So that's where we give our people effectively 5 days for volunteering and 5 days to use their skill set in a business environment for a charitable purpose. So again, we've been doing that for 15 years, but actually how can we pull that together and make that more effective so that more of our people take that up? Again, one of the other things we were looking at and we have achieved is carbon neutral. So our offices in the UK are carbon neutral. So again, that was a great achievement, but now we're looking at the next step in terms of where do we go from there. So a huge amount was going on. And what we want to do is pull that together to formulate a strategy, and then from that strategy, create a framework that shows and demonstrates both to our people, but also externally to our clients and potential clients that we are absolutely focused on how society succeeds. So that's my quick intro to that, and happy to take questions at the end. But with that, I'll pass over to James. James, you're on mute. 18 months.
If it didn't happen once every meeting, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting, would it? Let me see if I can share my screen. How's that? Is that visible?
That's great. Thanks, James.
So yeah, good morning. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present this morning. I'm James Fulford. I'm Director of Local Environment at Eunomia. That means a lot of my focus is on leading the work that we do for government and government agencies and local government, particularly in the UK. So my involvement in this agenda focuses on the advisory work we give to local government who are interested in their ESG reporting and their carbon reduction strategies, and to central government as it seeks to shape the agenda and develops legislation. Eunomia, so I guess what I'll talk about today is a little introduction to Eunomia, introduction to ESG and non-financial disclosures, what the UK obligations are at the moment and developments to date, what organisations, particularly professional services organisations, need to be thinking about, and I'll have a little bit of a look forward at future developments. So Eunomia is an environmental consultancy. I hear clearly and agree with Matt that the S and the G are important, very important as well. Two legs of the tripod. Eunomia is an environmental consultancy, so we're particularly focused on, and our work relates to the E in ESG. That's not unique to us. It's important to stress the other limbs because actually the momentum in this agenda, the dynamism in this agenda is greatest around the environment, and it's important that the other stuff isn't forgotten. Our advisory experience in this area builds off our own internal experience. We've been working for 20 years to establish targets, and we have a framework and a set of metrics developed under various headings. It's only relatively recently that we've signed up to science-based targets and have now a formal framework and a formal set of reporting standards. Everything until the last 3 or 4 years has been broadly internal. So we have managed very inexpensively, just by paying attention to what's going on and by talking about it, by having that lens by which we measure and think about the decisions before we make them. We've managed very inexpensively to, our carbon emissions per person are extremely low. Our recycling rate is absurdly high. We're up at 95, 96% recycling rate. It doesn't have negative impacts on the bottom line. And it builds a lot of support and engagement internally, and it's obviously, as an environmental consultancy, an important badge that we're able to say, we're doing this as well. Professional services, we have a big advantage given the type of operations we are talking about. The emissions from our offices, the emissions from our transport, a little bit of the emissions from our resource usage, but that's pretty minimal. So this is it's a really important agenda, but it's actually quite an easy one for, at least in the E area, for professional services companies to perform well on. A certain amount of attention will see fairly rapid progress. Given the advice we've given to the private sector and to local government, as I said before, we've been advising central government. We published a report a couple of years ago to the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial strategy, looking at the whole range of a very large, the landscape I'll show it on the subsequent slide, huge number of different frameworks and standards, and looking at attitudes, investor attitudes, retail and institutional investors, and then internal stakeholders. So what do employees think about it? What do partners think about it? What do prospective employees think about it? So that's our experience. The drivers for ESG and non-financial disclosures are, as I say, investors, internal stakeholders. With us also, with many of the people we advise, we find internal stakeholders are, certainly for professional services firms, amongst the most important drivers of this agenda. But the real push within the wider UK policy agenda is to provide good ESG reporting to standards that allow for investors to evaluate businesses and the risk that those businesses are carrying through activity or inactivity on climate carbon issues. So that's an important driver. There's obviously these things all bleed together. There's consumer interest in sustainable investment. When we interview people for focus groups for government, an important theme is that business should be doing better. It should be more than just profit maximisation. We need to rebuild trust in business, is a phrase that we hear often when we interview people engaged in and thinking about this agenda. And then there are also trends towards greater litigation. That's NGOs particularly looking to force the agenda and hold corporates accountable for their performance and to keep us honest as members of civic society. Interestingly, although this is increasingly mandatory, our experience is that simply adopting a set of standards and targets is a really strong first step. Thinking about these things corporately, giving permission or space in the conversations you have corporately to discuss these issues changes the decisions you make and drives changes. The reporting standards that we have, the landscape is an absolute mess. We have globally more than 400 frameworks and standards. They are not in all cases complementary. Let's put it that way. They are in some cases complementary, and actually I'm mixing apples and pears slightly here. Framework, I guess, is a conceptual framework. It's a philosophy. It's an area of focus. It explains what you're thinking about, and it might include within that framework standards and principles. So what you're aiming for and how you're going to go about it, and then some of those standards will be quantifiable. And if they are, and certainly if they're not, then beneath those will sit metrics, so that you can measure your performance, so you can set your targets and measure your performance towards those. Although there's a mess here, I guess it does allow for organisations to better tailor, to better select the standards and frameworks that work for them, that reflect their corporate priorities. Those that prepare standards and frameworks for corporates like the fact that there's a lot of variety, or tend to like the fact that there's a lot of variety. Personally, I don't. I agree with the view that's expressed, or what we hear expressed frequently by investors and internal stakeholders, that cross-comparability is more important. It would be good to rationalise this. And we're seeing some progress in that direction. Historically, the social and governance aspects of ESG, we lent towards those a little bit more. As I said before, there's more dynamism in the environmental side of it. So moving beyond the non-financial reporting of the Companies Act and Modern Slaveries Act, towards the establishment of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's a really important milestone in the development of this agenda, and it's got a distinctly British flavour to it as well. The Financial Stability Board was chaired in 2015 by Mark Carney whilst he was Governor of the Bank of England. So there was a significant British influence when the Financial Stability Board, which is an international central bank in cooperative institution or a set of agreements, they established the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. They made recommendations, that task force made recommendations in 2017 regarding what large corporates, particularly focused in the financial sector, should be reporting. And the UK government is now driving towards those. We have this year out for consultation a roadmap for the adoption, the increasing making it increasingly mandatory that companies sign up to report their climate-related financial disclosures. And there are a whole range of other policies and regulations coming down the line. From this month, if you want to contract with government for work worth more than 5 million per annum, you will need to have a carbon reduction plan in place. So what we're seeing is a whole range of different policies, all kind of supporting this same agenda, and with climate quite central to the conversation that UK government is having at the moment. The recommendations that the task force made sit under 4 headings: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. So starting kind of on the left, you're talking about describing the board's oversight, and then you're working all the way through a description of the risks and how you're planning to manage those, through to on the right, thinking about the metrics that you're going to use to measure and disclose and set targets for improvement as you move. This is the Treasury, HM Treasury's roadmap. This is for consultation and is built around a large number of different government departments, plans also which are out for consultation. So it's not exactly clear for certain where we're going, but the direction of travel is clear. More standards becoming more mandatory for a larger population of financial companies, UK listed companies, and increasingly just companies registered in the UK, which meet certain size thresholds by turnover and employee count. Those thresholds declining as we move through the decade. So, what do organisations need to think about? I guess the first question, which standards or frameworks are most useful, and you can get to that potentially with external advice, but the most important thing to be doing is to be having an internal conversation about what it is you want to achieve. Our view is slightly different, I think, than many other advisors in this area. I think that we have seen quite frequently companies adopting standards and seeing that as the start and the end of their ESG responsibilities. And in many cases, if you're talking about having an anti-slavery or human trafficking statement, the job is done as long as you maintain and live by that statement. If you're talking about moving towards net zero carbon emissions, then you're on a journey, and that needs to be managed and monitored on an ongoing basis. So what you sign up to and what you commit to, you're going to have to live with, and it's going to be challenging. So I think more than the standards and the frameworks you use, it's important to be thinking about what your targets are and what your carbon reduction plan is, what your improvement target is. So you want to know what your current position is, your carbon footprint, and how you're going to move forward from there. So I think that those are the most important things. How you're going to measure and what you're going to do. Future developments, we are increasingly seeing a drive towards standardisation around the standards. That's a conversation that's been ongoing and hasn't reconciled yet, but also standards for green investment. How do we know how do you measure the bang for your buck when you're investing in carbon capture and storage? Or how do you measure the bang for your buck when you're investing in rewilding or reforestation? Getting some metrics around that is an important part of what's happening at the moment, and will we hope unlock much greater investment once people are able to declare clearly what they're achieving with their money. And we're definitely, in terms of the environmental part, moving beyond climate impacts and starting to talk much more about biodiversity and habitat loss. We also have the task force on nature-related financial disclosures now, and that increasingly looks like it's going to have statutory government weight behind it as well. So this is an agenda which is broadening and deepening at the same time as it's gaining weight and momentum. And there are changes to emissions monitoring. I'm aware I'm overrunning on time, so let's not talk about scopes 1, 2, and 3 now. Summary of key messages. Agenda has significant government focus and momentum. The ESG landscape is a bit of a mess, but you shouldn't let that stop you, because what you say your plan for improvement is more important than how you say it, the reporting framework that you use. So that's it from me. Thank you for your attention. Sorry to other speakers for overrunning. Michelle, it's you next. So I nearly forgot that it's my responsibility to hand over to you, but
don't worry.
Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I would have worked it out. So all good. So I'm going to kind of take it back to the bigger picture again. And Matt set me up wonderfully when he said, I feel like an imposter. And I hear that a lot. And what I want to do, what my purpose in the ESG world is to make people not feel like imposters, to encourage and enable not just the partners in my firm, but also the marketplace to feel comfortable talking about ESG and to feel that they can own it and they can take it to heart. And to kind of get rid of that idea that you need to have a degree in biodiversity or soil acidification if you want to talk about ESG with confidence. I don't think that's where it is. I think it's in a different place, and I kind of want to pseudo-intellectualize it to get to that place. So Mel, if we can turn to the next slide. This is sitting back thinking time. So if you smoke a pipe, now's the time to light up. But make it a short pipe because I don't have very long. So I want to start with the foundation, which is ESG is an ideology, not a reporting requirement. And that doesn't necessarily contradict what James said, but I think if you can start with a very clear kind of root cause analysis of why are governments, why are regulators making me do all this, you can either start at that place and you can then comply with that regulation. But I think, as you can see, you can get lost really, really quickly. So I think you have to be able to stand back and say, why am I doing this? And I think if you have the mindset that ESG is an ideology, not a reporting requirement, then it'll make that flow into accepting the ESG requirements a lot easier. I kind of say it's, if you take it on as a mindset, then you're controlling it rather than it controlling you. And it's also much more exciting. And the persuasive arguments I try to use is, in my world, in the accounting world, we had to adopt IFRS 16 and lease accounting. Now, that is a reporting requirement. And I know that because my team never asked me any of the following questions about IFRS 16. They never voluntarily rang me up and said, can I get involved in whatever we're doing on IFRS 16? I really love lease accounting. Do you think we as a firm, BDO, could adopt this early because it's really important to me? Do you think there's any reading I could do on my holidays around IFRS 16? Do you think I could help write the training for IFRS 16? I didn't have any of those questions on the reporting requirement. I had all of those questions with regard to ESG. From random people in my firm who I've never met before rang me up and said, I'd really like to get involved. And that to me is the trigger that says, this is an ideology, it's not a reporting requirement. And if you can get the board to think that way, if you can get Matt White to think that way, then it's much easier to trickle down changes in approach, changes in policies and strategies from the top down. Next slide, please. The other kind of challenge that you might get is, well, it's a fad. It's something we'll move over. And people often talk about it's pimped up CSR. And I kind of, again, want to go back and again, kind of pseudo-intellectualizing it. It's not a fad, it's a correction. And if we go back to Adam Smith, who is the recognized founder of economics and free market, we know him because he's the guy that told us about the invisible hand. We know him because he's the guy that said, and I kind of misquote him, he said something like, the butcher and the baker don't provide me with services out of the goodness of their heart, they do it out of self-interest. And we've taken that concept, and that's what Adam Smith, the founder of economics, said economics was. And I kind of want to bring these other quotes in because he did say those things, but he said it within a slightly different context. He didn't think it was appropriate for self-interest to overtake people's responsibility, men's responsibility to the public. It wasn't appropriate to deceive or oppress the public. And he said it was important that even the lowest worker had to have a linen shirt, which wasn't a necessity of life, but it was important to them to have self-respect. And I think in this day and age, you can take out the word linen shirt and put living wage. It's not important just to pay people, it's to allow people to have their own pride. And even Adam Smith, the founder of economics, very much spoke about the civic responsibility of businesses in the free market. John Stuart Mill's, again, very similar. He was always a bit of a, he was much more soft. I mean, he was a feminist in the days when feminists didn't exist. So, you know, he always had that kind of leaning towards being much more societal in how we approach business. But again, these two are big people, big thinkers with regards to economics, and they very much adopted this idea of what we call today ESG. So how did it go wrong? If you can move to the next slide, please, Mel. This is where I think we made a little bit of a hiccup. The diagram on the left, if you're my age or a little bit younger, you'll probably recognize it. Actually, a bit older. I think this slide came around in about the mid 1950s, and I'm kind of unfairly going to blame Milton Friedman. But there was this the Chicago School of Economics, which kind of came up with this concept that this is what economics is. This is the science of the markets, and they came up with this diagram that focused purely on cash flow. And I think there was a reason behind that, in that they had a lot of American veterans coming back from the war, missing limbs in some instances. The economy wasn't great. There was not a lot of jobs to do. So there was this move to encourage these individuals to go to market themselves and set up their own business. But they needed to have a foundation understanding of what economics was. And this model was born. And we've taken that to be the holy grail of what economics truly is about. It's truly about following the cash flows. It's truly about making profit or increasing GDP. And I can kind of see that maybe in a world where fascism has been beaten, that communism was on the rise and there were Reds under the beds, that maybe it would have been un-American to focus too much on the civic side of business's responsibilities. It was very important to show that you were all American, you were focused on profits, not just you were focused on profits, but you were focusing on making more profit the following year as well. And we've just adopted that. And we went into the 80s where greed was good. And that's the way we've maintained it. And I think there's only one Western economy in the world that says we will not increase GDP. That is not our objective next year. I think New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern is the only government in play that's got into government by saying we will not go for an increase in GDP. But now we move to the 21st century very quickly, and we've got donut economics, which is on the right, from Kate Raworth. And you don't, you know, we call it ESG, we call it donut economics, call it stakeholder capitalism, you call it what you want, but this is fundamentally the ideological approach to ESG and business. This is how we do it. We play business within the donut. So the outside of the donut are the 9 planetary boundaries, which effectively we focus particularly on carbon and removing carbon from the world. And that's climate change. That's the big one for most businesses, and that's where you're seeing the regulatory push. But there's also biodiversity, which James mentioned. And I think, you know, in the not too distant future, not only are we going to be doing non-financial reporting around carbon, we're going to be doing it about what businesses are doing about biodiversity loss as well. And that's another exciting world as far as I'm concerned. It's really interesting that we businesses are being held responsible for these 9 planetary boundaries and our civic responsibility. And then on the inside of the donut, we've got the social responsibilities to ensure that we've got gender balance, to ensure that people have food, to ensure that people have, you know, the equivalent of a linen shirt. And again, that's what businesses are responsible for. That's bringing back, in my mind, our civic responsibility. But again, I think Adam Smith always intended there to be, but we just lost it somehow in the middle of the last century. Next slide, please. So I'm excited by that. I think it makes business more interesting. You know, it's much more fun to say that you've created a whole heap of good and you've had an increase in profits, rather than just say you've had an increase in profits. And the two go very much hand in hand. I think ESG, if you take it on as a mindset, and if you run your business with a purpose rather than with a purpose-driven role rather than a profit-driven role, you will actually inherently make more money as a byproduct. And this is why I think that. I think if you have an ESG mindset and you very clearly trickle that into everything you do and you report it and believe it, then you will have access to new revenue contracts. And James mentioned that already, if you want to get government contracts, you need to be able to sign up to certain CDP reporting data so that allows you in the door. And we definitely see it in our business. More and more, we're seeing that when people come for RFPs for us, firstly, we've got to get through the D&I checklist or the ESG or the carbon reporting checklist before we're even allowed to start to pitch. So it enables us to get good contracts, but we've also got clients currently talking to us about what our gender pay gap is and what is our strategy around that. So existing clients want to know. So there is a risk that we could lose them if we don't clearly identify that this is something we really are passionate about. And the employees, and I think James said this as well, and also Matt, the employers are pushing the agenda on this. They're really engaged with that, and that's what we see. So we want to get good candidates come in the door, but we want to keep staff that are good as well. And this is important to them. So again, we need to reflect to them that we do hear, we do understand, and we are employing an ESG mindset. We can get better, attractive finance terms as well. So Matt and I are talking to the BDO finance bank so that we can get the right loans based on our ESG credentials as well. And that could mean we get a longer term, or we could get a smaller rate, or any kind of flex that we need based on the fact that we're able to identify ESG benchmarks that they want to see and helps them. And then we get improved market valuation. So this is particularly important. Say that you're in the market for a PE buyer. Today, if you're a firm looking for an investor as a PE, you're looking for a PE investor, if you don't have a net zero plan, the value of your business will decrease automatically. You need to be already prepared for that devaluation. You'll be less attractive in the market if you don't currently have a plan to get to net zero. And then I mentioned it before, I think it's actually exciting. Money's great, money's fantastic, but money and extra civic responsibilities and challenges is better. And then I think we go back to the point of the social license to operate. If we don't do these things, you will get discredited in the marketplace. And I want to kind of talk about the fourth thing, if we move to the next slide, please, Mel, which is if you say you do these things and then you don't, or if you say you do them, but you don't do them completely, you will get roasted in the marketplace. So one of the things that I think is really important with regards to the ESG mindset is it's very risky to put yourself up on a pedestal and say, look, we're doing everything really, really well, because there are lots of organizations out there like Client Earth, as an example, who are there to see if that's true or not. So you really have to mean it and do it, or else you will get lambasted in the press. So we've taken off the name of this entity, but it's a brewery, a company that makes beer. But they very much push themselves in the marketplace as having really good environmental reputation and credibility. And then they unfortunately had an incident where their ex-employees, over 100 ex-employees apparently, signed this 65 of them, 61 of them signed it, but there were other 45 behind it who didn't want to sign it for fear of retribution, but said, look, this company isn't what it says it is. And then you can see from the top quote that the YouGov brand index fell from over 18 to down to 4.7. Now, I've got to say, in fairness, that company has not stopped being able to expand and market, and it's still doing reasonably well. But you never want bad press. Nobody says, yes, it's a fantastic opportunity if I've got some bad press. It's not great. So we want to avoid that. You have to walk the talk. Next slide, please. If you get to the point where you're now going, yep, I understand this is an ideology, I want to make my business less profit-driven and more purpose-driven, then you get down to the nitty-gritty of how does that impact every aspect of my business. So this is a generic model of what you would expect a board to look like and how it would establish itself. There are so many aspects of everything that your company does from an operational perspective, from a comms perspective, that are going to be impacted by taking on an ESG mindset. And I would always recommend that you start at board level, that you get that mindset in clearly, and that it's sponsored at the top, because that makes it a lot easier to understand why you're spending the money. And ESG is not necessarily the expensive option. It can actually make you money and save you money, but it makes it easier to then be able to make decisions at each of those levels. Why am I adopting this supplier value chain assessment? Why am I going and redesigning my procurement area and recontracting with my other players? Why is that important? So that kind of actually fits very well into the next session that Tim House will talk about with regards to how to take a strategy and beyond. So I will hand back to Andrew at that point.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for some fantastic insights. So I'm conscious we are running up a bit on time, but we do have some questions that we'd like to go through. And perhaps maybe Michelle, actually, if we just start with you on this one. How do you marry a professional services firm that is charged with effectively achieving a profit, sort of built into the definition of a partnership, with social purpose? Are they not totally contradictory?
I don't think so. I think that my personal view is professional services firms, we make a lot of money, and that's great. And I like personally making a lot of money, but after a while, you've made a lot of money, and the next 500,000, the next 200,000, the next 100,000 isn't that much more entertaining or satisfying. I kind of don't think that partners or professional services firms think like that anyway. I don't necessarily think we're all driven by money. I do think people are driven by excitement and challenge and intellectual stimulation, and these things are satisfying once you've earned a certain amount of money. And I think that's the realm that we're in, that we can now say, look, we're financially sound as a business and as individuals. What's the next really exciting challenge that we can take on, which means we get the best people in our firm? And that, by definition, I think is a virtuous circle, and it will open us up to better contracts, more interesting work, and that social license to prosper, but also probably do really well financially as well. And I also don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to want to make money. I don't necessarily think that is incongruous with wanting to have a social or a civic responsibility. I think the two are hand in hand, because you've got that ability in professional services firms where you've got wealth and you've got intellect. That's the right firm to then think about, well, what can we do in the broader picture? And I maybe this concept that we're all after a bigger paycheck, I think is potentially not really accurate. I don't think we are.
Thank you, Michelle. One for Matthew, if that's okay, Matt. So you talked a little bit about the cautious nature of professional services firms and the importance of not over-promising on what we do on this. Is there a danger that as a profession we aren't bold enough, and that potentially impacts our ability to attract clients and people in the future?
Yeah, I think that it's a fine balance. Michelle finished on the greenwashing side, and we've seen certain aspects, but certainly from a professional services point of view, within the accountancy profession, where we've been targeted, or certain firms have been targeted on the ESG promises made. And even if they're made with good intent, they're not always picked up on that. And so there is potential brand damage there. So I think that there is a balance in terms of how you go, to publicise what you're looking to achieve. But for me, it's about pace. And one thing that we are very focused on at the ESG executive level is to make sure we don't try and run before we can walk. And so for us, doing the materiality assessment, understanding our landscape, and really coming at it calm and saying, actually, what can we achieve and how do we achieve it, I think is the essential aspect of it. As I said, my biggest fear is that greenwashing stuff. I do not want certainly our firm in the press being, we've made these promises but have underachieved. So we are cautious with it. And could it slow down progress? Yes. But would it give it, I guess, better considered progress? I think the answer to that is yes as well.
Thank you, Matt. And if I may, maybe as a follow-on question, and maybe if others want to build on this as well, with that in mind, what does success look like 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now?
Success for me will be that this is still on the agenda. We won't have done ESG. For me, when we were originally looking for, I guess, what targets to set and what to achieve, you're looking out 10, 15, 20 years plus, and therefore I think it will always be work in progress. So for me, what does it look like? I think an energized ESG executive who are constantly scanning the horizon, but with some real change seen in the short term. So there are some easier wins. So carbon, and we're doing a huge amount on our carbon side of things at the moment. So real progress on that. And I think, again, coming back out of lockdown, the ability to build back better, I think would be really important. So for me, really focus on the international travel side stuff, which is one of our direct contributors in terms of carbon, but also having some strategy in terms of the social aspect. So for me, that would be really important. And whether that's at local level from one of the offices perspective, we have 17 around the UK. So whether it's one of the office level ones or if it's a national level in terms of societal aspects, I think that would be brilliant. So again, committing to that and progressing that. But this agenda will continue to evolve every year, and therefore I don't 5 years time is most probably too short a time horizon for the ESG executive. Maybe not for me, but for the ESG executive it most probably is.
It definitely feels like a fast moving world at the moment. Same question, James, from your perspective, actually. Five years from now, what does success look like?
I mean, I do think it's very difficult to predict because the agenda is developing. But if you think about, standards that were adopted 15 or 20 years ago around, company reporting or transparency for shareholders, those things now are just the cost of doing business. They're not thought of as nice to haves. They're the rules of the game. You can't trade reputably or legally without those things. I'd really like for us to be in a similar position on environmental and climate and nature related disclosures in 5 to 10 years. I'd like us to not see ESG as nice to have. What precisely ESG is will develop, but the core of what we think of as ESG now, I'd like to see that as just part of the rules of the game, something that we're all doing.
Thank you, James. We've had just a question on the chat. So thank you for this one. Question directed to Matt around. We were talking about all of the great ESG initiatives happening in the firm and how we bring those together and capitalise on them. In the time we have, and appreciate this, Mark, we might need to pick this up in a follow-on session as well. Any insights you can give around how we've gone about this, Matt, would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say we're still going about it. So we still find these brilliant things that we've been doing that some of us weren't necessarily aware of. So again, having an ESG executive to collate, I think, is really essential. So central body that is responsible and has that responsibility to collate all that information is essential. We have various groups through our strategic framework that look at the cultural aspects of our firm and our people aspect. And again, those champions around the firm collate a lot of that information and feed that in to the firm. We're over 6,500 people. So having different connectivity in different offices and in different streams is really important, and bringing that together. And I guess at the moment, we're not looking to say to anybody, no, you can't do that. What we're trying to do is actually, is there a better way of doing it? So we've not said, let's stop doing stuff. It's actually just, let's find out what we can do. And then I think once you've found that out, you can then suddenly go, well, actually, is that enough? And certainly from our perspective, we don't think it is enough. We had a number of, coming back to one of the comments again Michelle made, which is about purpose and profit. We had partner listening events where we had groups of 25-ish partners literally discussing about purpose and profit. How profitable should a firm be? How does that impact, and what's the responsibility on that side? And then we ran that again for some of our people to feed in to see what our people felt in terms of purpose and profit and how the firm should react. So for me, this is all about, I think, pulling the information together and then processing it. So we as I said, it's still very much work in progress, and we're still in very much gathering mode.
It's also about taking that and then making sure the internal comms are right. So what we've identified, I think, through having the ESG exec is that there's a lot of people doing a lot of good stuff, but they don't have a platform to tell everybody within the firm what they're doing. So I think the ESG exec is more successful when we're able to communicate out all the good that's already being done in the firm. And also then on the training and the educational side, pulling that together and making that available for everybody, and that level of transparency, not about promises, but what we're really doing.
Thank you for some fantastic insights. And if I may as well, what is the, maybe Michelle, if you want to take this one, what was the biggest barrier to achieving a change? We clearly need to go through something quite fundamental over over the next period? What is?
Yeah, I think it goes back. It really does go back to what Matt said. It's like I feel like an imposter. I do think there's that's not really uncommon. I think a lot of people, in some respects, fear ESG, and you can see why when James puts that slide up and says, "Look, here's the multitude of reporting standards." I mean, it's alphabet soup as well. So it does feel very scary. And again, I think it would be. I think you have to embrace it and say, look, nobody knows what they're doing. It's all new to everybody. But we're in a really good position where we've got a lot of brain cells around us. So if anybody can do it and anybody can work it out, we can. And then once you start at that kind of confidence, that kind of confidence enabler, then, just having the chats, having the discussions, and then working it out for yourself, how you feel comfortable with it, to go and to talk to about it and to demand change within your own firm. For me, that's the really important barrier to break down. I mean, this is not for geeks, it's for business people.
And anything I'd add there, Andrew, is there will be naysayers. So there will be people who will say, it doesn't matter what BDO does. We're not going to change the world, but that absolutely misses the point. And it is the collective impact of UK business and professional service firms and the wider societal impact that we can have combined, as opposed to the individual person or indeed organisation. And so, you will face some of these harder discussions where people and some individuals are driven by profit. I think that they're most probably more of the dinosaurs in terms of where we are in this cycle at the moment, and therefore the majority will be actually see it very clearly.
Thank you. And maybe just a slightly different direction on international. We've talked a lot about the UK landscape, but obviously we're an international organisation. We have a strong international network. Many organisations in the sector will be as well. And how accountable do we need to be for our international operations when it comes to ESG? Perhaps initially to Matt, but also to James.
I think, there's only so much, it depends on how you're structured. There's only so much you can be accountable for. And therefore, I think it's more about influence and ensuring that you're influencing at the right level. So as I said, I sit on our global steering committee for sustainability. That means I have an opportunity to really influence BDO on a global basis. Can I be held accountable, or can we be held accountable for what happens in every jurisdiction? No, they're all going through their own journeys as well, and some are at the same level as us in terms of that progression. Some are slightly further ahead, some are quite a long way behind. And so that accountability aspect, I think, is difficult, but the ability to influence is absolutely essential.
If I go back briefly to the previous question and the biggest challenges, I think that people who, as the conversation starts in a company where ESG hasn't been on the agenda previously, there's a reticence to change and potentially challenge the culture and the language that the business has used up to that point, and that can feel difficult. But what in my experience I've seen everywhere that I've had this conversation is that once you get over that hurdle that this is a new thing, that there's real strength of support. Colleagues step forward and say, yes, I think that as well. I think we should be doing more of this. So to build on the point that Matt is making about the cultural shift and how that looks as we start to look globally at the agenda, we need to be pulling our weight. We need to be contributing to the development of this global agenda. There's also a more boring answer. That we do now have international standards that are becoming increasingly important. The TCFD, TCMD, Sustainable Development Goals. These are things that are internationally significant, and the price of the cost of doing business will require that we are reporting to certain standards so that international investors can see and compare our performance to those of other companies trading in other territories.
Fantastic, James. Thank you. And sorry to have to cut you off. I think we are now up against time, and clearly we can see from the strength of the debate there's such a huge amount to cover on this. And consequently, we'll just give our in our final slide, Mel, if it's possible to put it up, just give a little plug to our further events. Unashamedly, we do have 2 further events, and we would love to welcome you. Please do get in touch with any questions with any of the speakers, and we will draw it to a close there and wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you all so much, and thank you to our fantastic speakers.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.